Hello, Jason, and welcome to this episode of Darwin the podcast. Thank you for joining me today, all the way from the Sacred Valley in Peru. I listened to your 3.5 hour podcast with my friend Paulette, whom I interviewed in season 2 of my podcast, and I just found your conversation really, really riveting. I'm really interested in working with tobacco. I discovered tobacco as plant medicine in 2019. And prior to that, I just had all the common misconceptions about tobacco that everyone has, like associating them with cigarettes. And I also worked in the World Health Organization, where they make you sign a paper that says, I will not consume tobacco products. I teach Reiki, and my level 1 manual, we also mention tobacco, like be careful with tobacco usage. And so there was a lot of unlearning for me to do when I started working with it. And I found out that I had a really good connection to it. Sadly, we don't really have access here in the Philippines to teachers of tobacco, or I haven't had access to them. But we do grow tobacco locally, as well as other plants that I work with, like cacao. The cacao is all over the place. And the good thing about tobacco is that it's legal, like cacao. So it's easy to share. There's no like fear or stuff like that around it. I'll stop talking, and Jason, I'll let you maybe introduce yourself, maybe share a little bit how you got to work with plant medicine and tobacco in particular, if that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you for having me. We were talking a little bit before we started, but Paulette really recommended you. And,
so sweet.
Yeah. It's a good question. It's always one of these kind of roundabout questions to answer, because it's who are we? It's always a good question.
Did I ask that? Yeah.
I guess the short answer would be, I mean, ever since I was a kid, I think I was interested in a few things. One was martial arts. I used to love watching like Steven Seagal movies and Jean-Claude Van Damme, and actually martial arts has been a pretty big part of my life. So that's something that I find very fascinating.
Where did you grow up?
Yeah, mostly in the US.
Okay. Which part?
I could travel around the East Coast, Virginia, which is kind of interesting with the tobacco.
I know.
And but yeah, I also always had a real fascination with, I think, with shamanism and spirituality.
You mean from a young age?
From a young age, yeah. It was interesting because I traveled quite a bit with my father. My father was really interested in kind of going to, at the time, what he considered like out of the way places, so these very remote places, very interested in indigenous cultures. So I was exposed to that from a young age. And so I think there was always a bit of that mystery and seeing people who had a very deep connection to nature and the natural world. And
what a blessing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even his room is like, his house is full of artifacts and different kind of things from other cultures, which always had like a bit of a shamanic tinge to them. I mean, they were very much in this realm of spirit, of connection, of tools, of rites, of rituals. So I think I was always surrounded by that. And then I got very interested in spirituality and religion, and I really started seeing, for me, how it seemed like all of these things were kind of communal, pointing to something very specific. But at a certain point, I became very interested in plant medicine, and it really started more through nutrition and herbalism, beginning to learn about these traditional practices like traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, and again, really seeing commonalities in that. But I was really looking at it more through like an allopathic lens, like looking at a symptom, seeing where something was off, trying to find a plant or an herb to treat that. But I had this idea of this more shamanic way of working, which I would say is more of an experiential connection to plants, to other states of consciousness. And it was something I had a very good sense that it existed, but I had never found a way or a path to really go into that deeply. And at a certain point, probably 10 or 15 years ago now, this one particular plant really started coming to me. And it may sound a bit cliche. Sometimes you hear it in this work, but I felt this very deep call to work with ayahuasca.
Yeah.
And I wanted to go to the Amazon, to where it was from, and work with people who had a knowledge of that. So I ended up going down to the Amazon. I had an amazing experience. It really opened me up to a lot of these things that I had a felt sense that could be tapped into. And then through that, I discovered tobacco. And so I was working a lot with ayahuasca. I ended up moving back down to the Amazon, working in a big ayahuasca center. And then I found who I would still consider my main teacher in this work, who was a tabaquero, someone who works with tobacco. And I just felt very drawn to him. He was also a martial artist. There was something about his presence, his demeanor, and something very much about that medicine of tobacco. It was interesting because even my grandparents' land used to be a tobacco farm. Being from Virginia, obviously tobacco is there, but I also had a strange relationship with it. I remember my father smoked, and I really couldn't stand it. I mean, I couldn't stand the smell of cigarettes. I found them very off-putting. And yet, when I would go to, I was in Cuba, for example, or other places where they have a tobacco culture, and I remember almost being like intoxicated by the smell of tobacco. There was something very alluring to it. And it seemed very strange. Yeah, cigars,
different
pipe tobacco.
from cigarettes.
Yeah, and that was very strange because it seemed like two very different things, and I couldn't quite wrap my head around it. Also, growing up, I was a Boy Scout, which there was a lot of reverence for a lot of Native American traditions, and I grew up very fascinated by Native American culture, and so I knew they also had this reverence for tobacco, but it was kind of hard to put two and two together. And when I came down to the Amazon, also realizing that a lot of these people who worked with ayahuasca also worked with tobacco. Yeah. And so there was something very intriguing about that to me. And at a certain point, I dieted tobacco, which is in the Amazon. It's one of the traditional ways in which people begin to learn from a plant. It's kind of developing a relationship with a plant. It often involves going into isolation, fasting for extended periods of times, and ingesting a plant. And so I started doing a lot of work with tobacco with this tobacco teacher. And it was very powerful. And I had dieted other plants in other traditions, mainly the Shipibo tradition. But it felt different somehow. Probably because the first couple times I drank it, I thought for sure I was going to die. I mean, it was extremely, extremely strong. But I think there was a real connection there personally that was very strong, very much like an initiatory experience. So, it's confusing, as you were saying, because tobacco, when we think about it, we usually have these very negative connotations of cigarettes and the problems those can cause. But I think it's more of a deeper issue that in a lot of the countries we come from, and I don't like to use the word West because, it's very limiting. And even as you were saying, I mean, you're living in the Philippines, and yet there's a very similar mentality. Yeah. And it's often very much this like reductionist mentality of we put things in boxes and we think that helps us to understand it, but we kind of forget about the wider picture. And I think a lot of people, when they would think of tobacco, would actually think of cigarettes and actually not realize that it's a plant. And that seems like a really silly thing, but a lot of people, it's difficult in a way to put two and two together. I think a lot of the problem too is how we view not only plants, but how we view food, how we view medicine, how we view drugs. And we have very particular views about those things. And we don't necessarily understand where the overlap is, where the difference. And even in this world of plant medicine, it's very fascinating because for example, in a lot of countries, things like marijuana are becoming much more accepted. Right. And yet there used to be a tremendous kind of bad view of marijuana and all of these plants. You look at opium, and there's wars against opium, and yet it's one of the most widely used medicine in the world. I mean, if you go into a hospital and get surgery, you're going to get morphine, and it's amazing. Life would be very difficult without that. All of these plants, these plants that are very strong. In the Amazon, they would say they have two sides. They have their light and their dark, and that may sound a little strange, but even from a more Western point of view, as Paracelsus said, one of the early Swiss physicians, the difference between medicine and poison is in the dose, and it's how you use a plant, how you dose it, the set and setting. And a plant like tobacco is very strong, and traditionally in the Americas, all the way from North America to South America, Central America. Interestingly, tobacco is considered the preeminent medicine plant. And if you think of all of the medicinal plants in the Americas, I mean, it's a cornucopia of medicine. And of all of the plants, tobacco is actually considered the premier medicine plant. And that's a real shift. It was considered not only a medicine, but like the medicine, like the highest medicine that.
So why is that? Why do you think that's the case?
Well, so in a lot of these cultures, this is a very basic way of looking at it, but there's a certain kind of hierarchy to plants.
Yeah, it sounds like
a lot of people are experiencing that, especially through like a plant like ayahuasca, which is very much spreading. And ayahuasca is considered a teacher plant. Even a lot of the ways people would speak of it, they would say like, I was in touch with the spirit of ayahuasca, or the mother of ayahuasca came and she taught me, or she healed me. And I think for a lot of people, that's a very strange concept to think about. Like the spirit of a plant came and it taught me and it healed me. And that's a very foreign way of thinking. But in these more traditional systems, there were certain plants, they're often called master plants or teacher plants, that have the ability to not only heal us on a physical level, on a mental, emotional level, on a spiritual level, but that they have this ability to teach us. And when one really begins to develop a relationship with that plant, one is actually able to use that plant to heal. And that's where the term, in a more indigenous setting, the term doctor comes from. Also in a Western sense, a doctor is someone who in general takes plants, even from a more pharmaceutical point of view, most pharmaceuticals are plant derived. So they take a plant and they're able to use that to heal people. You can treat someone on a physical level. They have a certain physical ailment. You can treat them. You can treat them on a mental, emotional ailment, which a lot of psychology is doing, psychiatry. It's also one of the emerging fields that people are really beginning to experience, which is this kind of idea of psychedelic assisted therapy, that we can actually treat mental conditions, things like PTSD, depression, anxiety, end of life fear of death.
My question was specifically, you mentioned that tobacco seems to be at the top of that hierarchy. Is that what you said? Why?
In many cultures, in many cultures it is.
How is that? What's the criteria? Like, why isn't it ayahuasca or mushroom?
Well, different cultures may have different views of that. Not all cultures use all plants, but in many of these cultures, I mean, I'll give you one example from a guy who I have a tremendous amount of respect for. His name is Amika, and he comes from the Colombian Amazon, this group of people called the Tubu people. And without going into too much detail, because there's a lot of story, but he would say that at a certain point in the past, in antiquity, maybe even eons ago, humanity was really suffering, and they were suffering because they had forgotten their story. They had forgotten who they were, where they came from. And so they kind of cried for help, and this cry was answered from this higher intelligence, which they would say actually came from the star system Sirius. And these beings, however you want to look at that, this energy, this spirit, transcended the 12 dimensions of time and space and came upon the canopy of the earth. And with them, they brought these medicines, these plant teachers that that were there to heal humanity, and they arrived to help humans remember where they came from, so that they could be happy, so that they could be whole.
From
so
another star system or something.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, I
And
love
so
it.
and so in this they would describe it as this
Amazing.
primordial anaconda canoe. And the anaconda has a lot of symbolism, not just in the Amazon, but really all over the world, even in Western medicine, that the snake is
Yes.
considered the symbol of medicine.
Yes.
Adam and Eve, it's the bringer of the knowledge of good and evil. But so in this Anaconda canoe were all of the different medicines. And the first medicine was actually tobacco. And that was considered the teacher. It was considered the one that really began to ground us, to give us
What
power.
do you mean by the first medicine? The first, like it had a place of honor on the canoe or something? Or
That's right. So there were a number of different medicines in this canoe, and tobacco was the first. And so with the
wow.
tubu, the tobacco is the plant you would begin to use, and you could use it in different ways. That you could drink it, you could chew it, you could snort it. There's a paste that you can lick. It's called ambil. And so that was really beginning to build one's power, to begin to connect to the spirit world, to build the base in a way.
Okay. So
And
that was in
then there was
yeah.
these other plants that followed that. Things like mushrooms or wachuma or peyote. And they would say these are the plants that really then begin to connect us to the earth, to this realm, to see things in a different way, but very much of this world, and to connect us to that, to see the oneness of all things, to see the interconnection, to see the beauty, to open our heart, to allow us to experience love. And then the next kind of tier would be, they would often say that there's a plant called toe, or in Colombia, they would say borrachera. And also it has this two sides. They would say
Angel's
it's
trumpet.
Angel's trumpet, yeah. And it's this plant that actually teaches us to become a doctor, but you have to be very careful because it has a dark side too. It can be very alluring. It can harm us also if we don't understand it correctly. And then the final kind of tier they would call the queens of knowledge, which is actually ayahuasca, yopo, which is a kind of a similar derivative, and jemaru, which is actually marijuana. And they would say when you ingest these plants, they would probably also put like iboga in that category, that these are the plants that allow us to go into the ethereal realms, to go into these other dimensions that allow us to gain knowledge and eventually to go home. So you have these two ends of the spectrum.
Right.
Like the tobacco is the roots. It's what begins to build the connection, to build the work, moving up to these plants that really allow us to go into these other dimensions, to experience this very high form of knowledge. And so, all of these things have this symbiotic relationship. But in that way, you had a lot of doctors who worked with tobacco, people who were called tabaqueros. And again, in that kind of symbology, the tobacco was often the plant that a lot of curanderos or doctors would say gave them their power. It's what allows them to do their work. It's what allows them to heal. Plants like maybe toe really allow them to do that work better. Plants like ayahuasca really allow them to see, allow them to diagnose, allow them to take information from other realms and to bring that back into the earth. So all of these plants have their place, they have their knowledge, they have their role.
Right.
But it's interesting because tobacco of all of those plants is often like a common thread. Even when you're working with those other plants, you're often always working with tobacco. Even very often in the dieting process, when you're dieting a plant, it's mixed with the juice of tobacco, or you're
it's
smoking
really like
tobacco.
a foundational medicine, it seems like.
Yeah, very much.
Jason, would you have a visual of that classification that you mentioned? Because I had never heard of that, but it now that I'm thinking about it, I can see how that makes sense, like even personally. So have you ever seen that like laid out on I don't know, some sort of diagram, that whole classification
I
you
haven't.
mentioned?
maybe someone has done that. A
Yeah.
lot of these traditions are more oral
Yeah, yeah.
and
Maybe I'll do it.
and
I
yeah.
like that classification of plant medicine that you described. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. That
And there's
makes
something
sense.
powerful about that oral tradition. I think a lot of
Yes,
times people look at
true.
that as maybe like it's primitive. For whatever reason, they didn't decide to write things down. But I don't know that that's true, because even like the example I gave you with Amika, before anyone uses any of these medicines, you always have to tell the story. And there's a real power in the storytelling. And it's more than just kind of creating a ceremony, creating a set and setting. There's almost like these, this may sound funny, but these how would you translate it? Like healing codes
Yeah.
that are transmitted in the story that actually are part of the healing process, that are part of the learning process. And so by telling that story,
Yeah.
there's a tremendous amount of learning and healing that happens just from that story.
That makes total sense to me. In Reiki, we talk about kotodama, which is the power of the chant, the power of the word, which is it's healing just by the yeah by speaking the words like that. So that makes sense. Yeah. Let's say we want to start to work with tobacco and we don't have access to like the full dietas that I know you're organizing there and you're facilitating. Here we have access to hape actually. So my friends make it, and then we can also import some, and so that's been shared in the community quite a bit. But like I've never personally ingested the tea form. Is that something I could experiment with, or you wouldn't recommend? I'm just going straight to the point.
Um, I think a good way is again how I'm using the same example, but going back to Amika in this idea of the Anaconda canoe, that all of these medicines have their place, and there's different ways we can use these medicine. What's fascinating about tobacco is there are different ways to use it. Some of the ways are considered like much more daily ways in which it can be worked with. People can smoke it, people can chew it, people can lick it, people can snort it. Those are all ways that one can begin to develop a relationship with tobacco. And there's not necessarily a universal way. Different traditions have different ways, different rites, different rituals, different rules, different regulations. In general, those ways are considered like softer ways. Not always, because again, the dose can change a lot. If you smoke really strong mapacho and you smoke a lot of it,
Yeah.
you're going to feel it.
Yeah.
You're going to go into a pretty rough experience. If you're licking it or chewing it and you do too much of it, you're going to get super sick. If you snort it
So what are
and you snort
the
enough,
symptoms of overdose of tobacco? Is it purging mostly, or headache,
a lot of
or?
purging, a lot of nausea. You may go into an altered state of consciousness. That can happen at certain doses.
But that's
In
not the main
general,
intention, right? When working with tobacco, not
well, it can be. It can be
it
because
can be.
again, tobacco is one of these plants that can heal on all of the levels. So it can heal on the physical level. So often there's a lot of purging. Uh, Very much how maybe you would think of it in like traditional Chinese medicine, this idea that we have these meridians in our body, and
Yeah,
then a lot of ailments can come when there's a blockage or
yeah.
something is stuck. Tobacco very much begins to open that
Fair.
to allow that energy to begin to flow again. Healing on the mental emotional level, there's often kind of archetypal qualities that people experience with these different plants. Very much with tobacco, there's this archetypal quality of clarity, of groundedness, of peace, of strength. So that's very much healing us on that mental emotional level. And then there's the level of spirit of really beginning to remember, as like Amika was saying, who we are, where we come from, what our place in this world is. What does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to remember? What does it mean to be alive, to be related to life, to dance with life? With tobacco, I think tobacco is a very strong plant. It can be used in softer ways, and if people feel called in that way, I think it's great. You know, if people work with a pipe, or they work with mapacho, or they work with rape, you know, I think that's great. There is something to be said with, I think, learning from a tradition, because there's a lot that can be lost, and I think that's something that even more and more people are speaking about, more like with ayahuasca.
Yeah.
If these things aren't worked with in a good way, uh, you know, not only can they have physical deleterious effects, but they can have mental, emotional
Oh,
effects
yes.
too. There can often be, people have really bad experiences.
Yes.
People experience ego inflation. They experience delusions
Yes.
of grandeur. So there's something to tradition. With tobacco, all of those, again, those ways I described are considered ways that people can kind of begin to develop a daily connection with it. The main way that tobacco is usually used as medicine for learning is ingesting it in its liquid form. And that's the thing 100% you should never experience or experiment with, because
Okay.
it's very, very strong.
That's what I was
And if
curious
someone
about.
doesn't work with someone, who knows what they're doing, I mean, you could, on the on the
Harm
extreme
yourself.
end of the spectrum, you could actually die, because it's
Oh,
it's
okay.
very, very strong.
Okay.
So with that, you really need to work with someone, and it's not only the physical component where you could have an adverse reaction to. It's you're very much like any of these master plants, like ayahuasca or wachuma. We would often use the kind of analogy that you're going into open heart surgery, and much like
Yeah.
you
Oh.
wouldn't want to just open your heart and
Dive
surgery on
right in.
yourself.
Yeah. Without
You want to
a
make
surgeon.
sure,
That's a
you want
good
to make sure you're
analogy.
working with a really good
Yeah.
surgeon, because you're entering kind of a whole nother space, which is
Yeah.
very foreign to people. And always in the beginning, we need help. We need a guide. We need someone who can also help to navigate that space, so that we really, benefit from the
Yeah.
medicine that these plants have to offer.
How do you feel about, like, some people here have a daily rape practice? So how do you feel about that? Is that something to be careful with, or
Mhm.
something you feel is, like you said, very personal?
I think ultimately these things, they are personal.
Yeah.
No two people are the same.
Yeah.
People are going to have different relationships, different
Yeah.
reactions.
Yeah.
In general, I think the way that rape is being used, it's not a very traditional way in which it was used. It's it's
Yeah.
used in smaller doses.
Yeah.
Usually the medicine is not very strong,
Right.
because like a lot of these plants, even with tobacco, it begins to lose its power very quickly once it's processed.
Right. Right.
Um, so, even by the time most people get the rape, it's probably at least a few
Right.
weeks, maybe
For
months, maybe
sure.
even years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Less
you know,
potent. Yeah. It's less potent.
less potent, yeah. I mean, when I've used it with two groups of people who carry that tradition. One is the Matses, and the other is the guy who I described, Amika. And both of those, when you get hit with rape, it's usually through a very long tube. It's very, very strong. I
Looks
mean,
violent. Looks so intense.
most
Yeah.
most people dread receiving it.
Yeah.
It's very strong. You often purge. You often have a very adverse reaction to it. It's often administered multiple times, and often it becomes a psychedelic medicine. People journey with it. It's often done at night, very much to open that dream space. So
At
it's a
night.
very different process. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
Again,
okay.
there's often a lot of other things around it, storytelling. It's often done in a group setting. There's a communal aspect to it. There's a bringing a harmony of a group together. There's teaching, there's story, there's the power of the word. It's also opening us to really receive that knowledge too,
Yeah.
not only from the storyteller, the teacher, the healer, but really tapping us into to that dream space, to that altered state of consciousness where a lot of teaching comes as well.
I stopped using it at night because I can't sleep.
Well, that's one of the purposes
Yeah.
of it.
But is there do people practice in the morning as well? Because I've been taking it more in the morning.
Well, again, From my understanding, that's not the way it was used, but like all of these
Good to
things,
know.
these medicines change too.
Yeah.
None of these cultures are inherently stagnant too, and
Right, right.
these
Everything is
medicines.
shifting and evolving. Yeah, I
Yeah,
understand. Yeah.
absolutely. And like anything, it's I think developing that personal relationship with it, if people feel they're gaining benefit from it, and then that's a good thing. And I think there is kind of one caveat too, which is a lot of these medicines were used in a communal setting or with
Yeah.
a teacher. And I think that's important too, because like that example I used with ayahuasca, it's important that you feel that you're gaining something from it. That's
Yeah.
vital, but also in a way that community or the teacher also sees that you're gaining something from it, because that's
Mm.
where I think sometimes that line can be a little
Mm.
tricky, where even in this work, there's this very common motif of the difference between a healer and a witch, a curandero and a brujo. And nobody ever thinks that they're the brujo. The brujo is always someone else.
Oh.
It's always someone else
I
from
like
another
that.
side.
Mm.
But it's very important that there's, I think, checks and balances that we realize, like when we are beginning to come out of alignment, that there's a community, that there's a teacher that helps us to bring us back into alignment. And sometimes if we don't have that, these medicines can also be a little tricky to begin to navigate, because we can think, oh my God, now I'm the greatest person and I have all this power and I'm getting it from this medicine. But from someone else's point of view, it could be very clear that, hey, like this isn't quite in alignment. We need to bring this back into alignment.
Okay, so I want to talk with you briefly about another plant that I've been called to work with. But before that, can you just talk a little bit about your use of the word power? I think people have an idea of power, maybe like external power, right? So you've been using that word with tobacco, and that ayahuasca is more like a third eye opener, and then tobacco. And I even messaged you that I want to talk about this, like, what do you mean by power when you talk about it in relation to tobacco?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in all of these shamanic traditions, there's very much this idea of power, and it's um, I think in the most basic way of looking at it, it's really this internal power. It's finding who we are, finding our own strength, and it's something that I think often in this day and age we don't like to talk about. I think there's often like very much a diffusion of responsibility, uh, and you see it. I think anyone who does any sort of healing work, it's one of the main things that we battle with in a way is this idea of finding our own power, and that so much of our suffering comes when we give that away, when we begin to blame our parents, our partners, our life circumstance, the government, corporations, capitalism. There's a million things that we can blame that really begin to take away our power. And as long as we're giving that power away, we're always going to be sick. And I think that's really hard for people to hear, because it's much easier to diffuse that power, because then there's not a responsibility that comes with that. And there's actually there's like a self-preservation mechanism with that's actually very useful. Often that can help to preserve us in a way when we diffuse that power, maybe because we're not ready to take that responsibility yet. There's probably a guy you've heard of. We work with him some. His name is Gabor Mate, and I think in a way he speaks of it very well, because he focuses a lot on the childhood, and very much when we're a child, like we don't have that power. We're reliant on our mother. We're reliant on our father to protect us, on our mother to feed us. But as we get older, and we become more and more into our own power, that becomes less and less valuable to us. And part of becoming an adult, and I think something we've also really lost in a lot of the cultures we come from, are these coming of age ceremonies, where there's this stepping away of, okay, now I'm no longer a boy, I'm no longer a girl, I'm a woman now, I'm a responsibility that comes with that. There's no more, well, I did something silly. Well, I'm just a kid. It's not a big deal. No, I did something silly. There's a consequence for that now, and I have to take responsibility for it. And part of that power, I think, in any of these like more shamanic paths, is really beginning to find that internal power, to find that internal strength, to begin to take control of our lives, to become independent in a way. And a lot of these plants really help us to see that. They help us to see, where have I been out of alignment? Where am I giving away my power? Where am I blaming? Where am I looking at things and not taking that responsibility? And how do I begin to cultivate that? How do I begin to become the master of my own destiny? And the more we do that, the more, in a way, I think our lives become in alignment. They become in alignment to source, to spirit, to God, to nature, to harmony, however we want to look at that. These words like integrity or integral, it means to be in wholeness. And even disease means that. Disease means to not be at ease. In Christianity, it's the word sin. It's the same as in yoga, to yoke. It's this idea that when we're steering the oxen is never going completely straight. It goes a little bit to the left, so we need to bring it back to center. But we pull too hard and it goes too much to the right, so we have to bring it back to center. And so this idea of trying to maintain integrity, trying to maintain wholeness, and I think that's where that power comes from. As a participant, it's something that's very personal. It's like taking power over our lives, beginning to remember, beginning to discover who we are. In the more shamanic realm, like I was speaking of like a doctor or a curandero, that power, it's the same in that it's this internal power. It could often be described even like vipassana. It means to see things how they actually are, to see reality as it actually is. And with that, we develop this power, this humility, this strength to be able to do this work. And that power could be, very, very practical, in the practical realm of like, do I have the fortitude to be able to hold space with these medicines? Like, have I done the work to be able to give this medicine when things come up? Am I able to manage that? Am I able to navigate that with other people? In the mental emotional realm, like, am I able to work with people? Like, have I done that work with myself so that I can actually help people if they come in need? And then in that realm of spirit, which is maybe a little more obscure for some people to understand, but when we're working in these realms of spirit, of of plant spirits, of ancestors, of light and dark and good and evil, do I have that power to be able to navigate that? Can I bring things into alignment? Can I push away what's no longer serving? And can I call in the light? Can I call in what is serving? Also, power can have its light and dark. And what I've been describing is the light side of that.
Right.
The dark side of power would be, as I think we all know, anyone who has power and uses that not for the light, but for the dark, whether that's for seduction or greed or, envy or control or for ruling, for slavery, those would all be the dark side of power. It's when we use that out of integrity, out of wholeness, out of union, when we begin to divide, when we begin to distract, to compartmentalize, to reduce, then it's not serving. So like all of these things, power, it can serve a tremendous good, but that's where, as I was kind of alluding to earlier, having like a teacher, having a tradition is very important, so that we always know how to keep that in check, how to navigate that in a way that's actually serving rather than dividing.
I never really made that distinction that you made between ayahuasca and tobacco being more focused on power. But now that I'm feeling into that, it's very clear to me how true that is for me personally. But the way you describe it, like all of that journey of self-discovery, I feel like the other plants also inform that journey, whether it's mushroom or ayahuasca. And so what would you say is really the main, like the main difference? If somebody's like a total newbie to plant medicine and they're like, what's the difference between, tobacco and ayahuasca?
In a way, it's like, what's the difference between you and me? On an essential level, we're spirit. We come from source. We're a manifestation of life, and yet we're different. We have different qualities. You have a beautiful smile. My smile's not quite like that. So that's part of your gift. That's part of your light. And all of these plants are considered gifts. They're teachers, but they have different ways of working.
Okay.
Ultimately, I think any of these plants that are considered teacher plants, they're whole in themselves. If that's all you had was one plant, that would be enough.
Okay.
All of these plants can give you
that.
everything.
That's beautiful.
And yet they work in different ways. And they also all of these plants come from a very specific place, a very specific time, a very specific culture. There's a context in which they're used. There's rites and rituals to really begin to be able to experience all of the benefits of these plants. And so it's also difficult in a way to just extract the plant from that setting too, because a lot of what's being worked with is to balance that plant. Some plants may be stronger in some aspects and less strong than other plants in other aspects, but there may be rites and rituals that draw some of those qualities out that really aid in that way. So any of these plants, I think, can be worked with again as a whole. And there's many cultures that work with multiple plants because they also see the benefit in those medicines. That in certain situations, this plant may be what we need. And in other situations, this plant is what we need. And so like understanding the qualities, understanding when a plant is beneficial. And that takes someone who serves that role, whether that's the storyteller, the doctor, the herbalist, to really know when to use those plants and how to use them in the context and the stories and the medicines and the rites and the rituals.
I'll just ask you about this other plant I've just been seeing a lot of it, and a friend of mine works with it. It's a Toei. What is your experience with this plant?
It's interestingly, it's a plant I haven't dieted, and it's another one of those plants where I know I will at some point, but I've always really tried to listen to my intuition and work with a plant when I really feel called with it. So I know for myself, there's that calling to work with it. I just still haven't found the right setting to do that with.
Something to discover also.
The lady who I do a lot of work with, Marav, she's worked with Toei. My teachers worked with Toei. I've worked with a lot of Shipibo who've worked with Toei. But it's in many, especially in the Amazon, in many of these traditions, it's considered one of the plants that allows you to be a doctor. So it's
because it's so tricky.
Again,
it's tricky to work with.
Be. It's very strong. It very much opens up the visionary space, and it very much teaches. So it teaches one how to begin to diagnose, how to heal, how to teach. Again, there's people who just work with Toei, and in the same way, there's people who just work with tobacco or just work with ayahuasca, just work with Sanango. It's considered one of these, I'd say, handful or dozen plants that allows one to be able to work in this realm of spirit, not just on the physical level, but in that way of working with people in these other realms as well. It's a plant that you see even in Europe. It's
all over.
It's all over. In India, you find it. A lot of people think the tradition of the witches in Europe, that was the main plant that they were using, was Toei. Even if you look at like a lot of old European drawings, I remember seeing one recently. It's this woman laying in the forest, and she's obviously like she's kind of journeying or something, and right behind her is a Toei plant. So
It's such a beautiful flower. I mean, who wouldn't wanna, hang with it?
People also
Um,
use it a lot for this idea of divination, which
oh,
there's a number of plants in Mexico. Salvia is used, Salvia divinorum. Toei is used in that way to be able to find an answer to something.
okay.
And sometimes that's very practical, like someone stole all of my farm animals. Who did it?
Yeah.
And they'll use Toei to
Who done
find that
it?
answer. They may go to someone who works with Toei, but they even may work it with themselves. A lot of times,
Yeah.
people will sit under a Toei tree
I was gonna.
and
I was thinking next time I'll just sit under and be like, wait, some dew
people will
to
take
fall.
yeah, people will take the leaves of the
Yeah,
plant and put them under their pillow or put them on their head when they sleep at
on
night.
their altar.
Let them have
Yeah, yeah,
some space. Yeah.
yeah. And so,
But
and also,
again, it's
yeah.
considered a very, very powerful plant.
Yes, I
And again,
know. I
again,
know.
one that really one should only work with someone who has a lot of experience because it's very, very, very strong.
No DIY there.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And then one more plant that you mentioned is Sanango. Is
Mhm.
that so? I've had that in eye drop form. Is that the same thing we're talking about?
It's actually not. That's usually called Sananga.
Ah, okay,
Sanango
that's
is
different.
Sananga is actually an interesting plant. I don't know a lot about it, but it's actually the same family as Iboga. Um,
Okay.
and but yeah, the Sananga,
Oh, so they're
it's often
different.
eye
Okay.
drops that you would apply to your eye. Sanango is a family of plants. You find them in the Amazon. You can find them outside of the Amazon as well. I can't remember where now. But the most common one that people often refer to is Chirik Sanango. And again, it's this plant.
Okay.
There's a lot of curanderos who are considered sanangueros. They heal with this plant. It's a very strong plant. They say, again, very similar to Chinese medicine, that a lot of ailments come from an excess of heat or cold
Yeah.
internally. So Sanango really extracts this cold. It takes out the cold. So it's really good for things like rheumatism, arthritis, muscle pains. But it's also a teacher plant. So it allows us to heal on all three of those levels as well.
Beautiful. Thank you. So Jason, what exactly do you have offerings that can people work with you one-on-one, or is it more like the retreats that you're focusing on at the moment?
Predominantly, well, I'm doing a few things. More and more of my main work is working with tobacco and working with dietas.
Yeah,
Again,
yeah,
this is one of the main ways in which we learn experientially from plants. We predominantly work with tobacco because that's the way I was trained. And tobacco is, as I was mentioning earlier, it's this medium that allows us to really experience the plants. So we diet tobacco, but usually when we're dieting other plants, but they're mixed with tobacco.
yeah. Okay.
And so it's this process of learning experientially from the plant with the aid of
The other one.
myself or the lady I work with, kind of guiding that process. We mainly work with trees because trees are also in an archetypal way seen as like the main plant teachers. They're these very ancient beings, very old. They also bridge the two worlds between the earth and the heavens. They root into the earth. They bridge up to the heavens. A lot of traditions around the world. I mean, even if you look at like Druidic traditions, there's a huge reverence for trees.
Yeah.
I think it's really kind
Love
of a
trees.
knowledge that's been lost, but very much in the Amazon, there's groups of people who've still
Yeah.
held on to that. So mainly we offer diets, working
How long
with
are the
tobacco.
dietas?
We're usually doing between 7 and 14 days,
Okay.
but people will often come for multiple dietas. So
Oh,
um,
back to
they
back.
may come for 7 days, they may come for 14, 21, a month. Usually a month is the longest because
Yeah.
the diet really
It's
begins to
something.
weaken the person physically, mentally, emotionally.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
very strong. So
I would
a month
probably
is
start
usually
with a week. That would be
a
good for
week is a
me.
great place to
Yeah,
start.
yeah.
We often recommend that people can do 2 weeks. That's a
Yeah.
really good way to go deep. And then a month usually at the max. So that's really the main work I'm beginning to do. I also, for the last 10 years, I've worked at a large ayahuasca center, working with a group of people called the Shipibo people. It's called the Temple of the Way of Light. I'm actually headed there in about a week to run a few workshops. That's located in the Peruvian Amazon near the city of Iquitos. That's an amazing place to go if anyone is interested in working with ayahuasca. And then also I have a podcast now.
I'll put that in the notes. How long have you had your podcast?
A little over a year now. I actually
Yeah.
started when the pandemic began because
Same. Yeah.
down.
Yeah.
And yeah, really the idea with that is to give voice to people who I respect. I think people who are involved in this plant medicine work,
Exactly.
and to begin to share it, because this work is really spreading.
Yes.
A lot, again, this idea of duality of light and dark, I think for the most part that's really good, but there's a dark side to that too. There's a downside, and I think the more wisdom and knowledge of how these plants can really be worked with in a beautiful way, that's really important to help the spread of this work, continue to go in a good way, rather than falling into some of the pitfalls of it.
So your podcast focuses on plant medicine.
Yeah, almost all is plant medicine.
Yeah.
There's some that are a little different, like some martial arts. I have a few podcasts on that. And plant medicine is a big topic. Most of it is more of this shamanic way of working, but some is not, like things like herbalism or Chinese medicine, or I just did one on essential oils. So maybe a better way of putting it is kind of holistic medicine, spirituality, but really the predominant focus is plant medicine.
Is there anything else you would like to share?
The website for the tobacco work is nicotianarustica.org.
It's a beautiful website, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah. The podcast is called The Universe Within. You can find it on all of there's a YouTube version of it, so there's a video version, and then any of the major podcast platforms. Plant medicine is amazing. It's the more I do this work, I think it's really at the root of spiritual traditions all over the world. And so I think there's something to be said for that. There's a real power. It's very much, as I was mentioning in the beginning of the podcast, this idea of remembering who we are, remembering where we came from. So there's a tremendous power with that. But also with that, again, this idea of duality, there's a big responsibility with that, and it's not something to be taken lightly. There's a reason that all of these cultures from all over the world, they had a tremendous reverence for these plants, but there was a tremendous amount of preparation, of rites, of rituals, of understanding, of preparing oneself, and initiation, and that's really important. So, I think more and more people are being called to work with these plants, which is amazing, and really just to the best you can, doing your research, whether it's listening to podcasts like yourself or mine. There's some good resources out there, and really just finding places and people that you feel really good with, because that's really important. More and more, whether it's in the Amazon or here in Peru or elsewhere, like with anything, when there's a demand for things, the supply begins to increase, and there's a lot of people who have really good intention. And I think that's super important. With good intention, things can work really well. But there's also, to a certain extent, because there's very few people who I think really can do this work well. And it's important to really find those people. And that's tough. It's tough to really know that, but
that's just part of the journey, part of the journey. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, you don't want it to be accessible to any, I think it's part of the fun, part of the right. Getting to the right people and the right teachers.
Being gentle with yourself, that's super important. Being gentle, being patient.
I actually wanted to share one last story with you before I let you go, is how I met Paulette. And actually it's through tobacco. because I had a plant ceremony, and one of my Reiki students was like, "I'm gonna bring my cousin. She's from Peru. She's had so many plant ceremonies." And I remember I was so nervous, and so I had a cacao ceremony, and I was offering a so I was blowing and Paulette was amazing. You know, she was so sweet, and she appreciated my medicine. You know, so very supportive and encouraging. So I'm really, really so grateful for that. But that's funny. I just remembered now. Like I was serving tobacco to Paulette. That's how we met. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, she's great. She's a wonderful person.
Yeah, she is. Hi, Paulette. So Jason, I wish you a great time in the jungle. Well, I don't know if it's a great time, but a powerful time. And thank you for your energy and your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. It was lovely. And thank you for doing what you're doing and sharing your medicine and getting voices out there. I think it's a really beautiful thing. So thank you for having me on and your presence. And yeah, I wish you all the best. And I have a feeling our paths will cross in the future too.
That would be amazing. Have a dieta here. Oh my God, that would be so beautiful. Yeah. There's some wonderful places here. You would love it here.
I would. I've
I've
traveled all over Southeast Asia, but I've actually never been to the Philippines.
Oh my God. Paulette's gonna bring you here. You're gonna love it. Yeah.
Thank you so
much. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye.